Hi, good morning. Terry here, and welcome to Times Gone Tech and to part two of my 2026 St. Valentine's Day special. Now, at 10:30 a.m. on February the 14th, 1929, there were 7 men inside the SMC Cartage Company located at 2122 North Clark Street, Lincoln Park, Chicago, Illinois. Now, they were there for what they thought was to be a delivery of a truckload of stolen bootleg whiskey. Now, those 7 men were the two brothers, Peter and Frank Gusenberg, and they were the North Side Gang's two top triggermen. There was Albert Kachelik. He was George Moran's brother-in-law and second in command of the gang. There was Adam Hayer, who was the gang's business manager. He handled all the money in and out. There was a mechanic, John May. Now, John May wasn't actually a member of the gang, but he did do mechanic work occasionally for the gang. He was there working on a truck. Now, there was also a guy there named Reinhard Schwimmer. Now, Schwimmer is an interesting character because he's a total loser, this guy. He was an optical lens fitter, but he called himself an optometrist. And he was also a very poor gambler and was constantly in debt. And he had recently quit his job and was living with his widowed mother. Now, he had developed a strange interest in the gangster lifestyle and had managed to befriend several members of the North Side Gang. Now, he just happened by that morning. He saw Pete's car outside and decided to stop in, say hello, have a cup of coffee. His sense of timing wasn't really very good either. And then finally, right around 10:30, a man named Albert Weinshanker, also known as Weinshank, showed up. Now, Weinshank technically was a part of the gang, but not really. He just managed a series of non-union cleaning and dyeing operations for Moran. And he'd recently had some problems with the union trying to work in. He'd actually had his life threatened with a shotgun, and he had just come by to say he was quitting. He picked a bad day to quit his job.
Looks like I picked the wrong week to quit smoking.
Now, the problem was, first of all, the two lookouts in the boarding house across the street were only seeing the backs of the people as they showed up and walked into the garage. Also, visibility that morning was really bad. Now, it wasn't snowing like they always show in the movies, but there was actually little ice crystals, and it was really windy. And those things were just blowing sideways like needles. And so visibility was really bad. And they didn't actually know what Moran really looked like. Moran maintained a very low public profile, unlike Al Capone, who loved being in the limelight. So they were going more by his general appearance, his build. He was a big man, and he typically wore a brown overcoat, hat, and a white scarf. Oh, by the way, to give you an idea of how low his public profile was, George Moran wasn't actually his real name. And at the hotel where he lived, he went by a third name, George Miller. His real name was Adelard Leo Cunin. And that's a really sing for a name for a gangster like Bugs Moran, does it? But yeah, Adelard. I kind of like it. Anyway, the thing is, when Weinshank showed up, he was also a large man, and he was also wearing a brown overcoat and a white scarf. So the two lookouts mistook him for Moran and called in prematurely and set the trap just a little too early. Moran was still kind of strolling down the street on his way there. So while George Moran, Adelard Leo Cunin, and his two bodyguards were strolling toward the SMC Cartage Company, a police car showed up. 4 men got out, 2 of them dressed as police officers, and went inside. Now, Moran assumed it was a police raid and stopped, and there was a cafe right to his left. So he decided to step into that cafe and get a cup of coffee and just wait until things blew over. And he hoped that Sorello didn't show up with the whiskey while the cops were there. Now, inside the Cartage Company, the 2 cops had all 7 men line up against a brick wall like they was going to frisk them. But instead, the two assassins, Scalise and Anselmi, they then came in with machine guns and proceeded to fire 70 rounds into the 7 men's backs, nearly cutting a couple of them in half. Then they gave May and Kachalik a blast each from a shotgun, and it nearly blew May, the mechanics, nearly blew his face off. They then pretended like the two assassins were under arrest, hands in the air. Cops had a gun on them, walked outside, got in their car, and drove away. Now, Moran saw them drive away, so he decided to go into the cartage company and see what had happened. But as he got out on the street and was walking toward it, he heard a boy cry out that there'd been a shooting in the garage and Moran had been killed. Well, Moran just immediately turned around and disappeared back into the crowd. Now, Frank Gusenberg was the only one to survive the immediate attack. And in fact, he managed to crawl 20 feet by the time the police showed up, even though he'd been shot 14 times in the back. And he lived for 3 hours. He died later at the hospital. And when the police asked him who shot him, in true gangland style, he replied, "No one. No one shot me." And he died. In keeping with the gangster credo of, you never squeal to the cops about anything, not even about who it was who killed you. Not that he could have identified them anyway, because he didn't know the two cops, and he'd probably never seen Anselmi and Scalise before they were Italians. But he wasn't even going to tell the cops that much. Kind of like that loyalty, that sense of, gang that even gangsters had back then. Here's where we see just how non-violent America really was back in the 1920s. 7 men had been murdered, shot in the back, in a garage in Chicago, but 4 of them were known gangsters and known killers anyway. So, given the times, 800 gangsters had been killed in Chicago alone over the past 9 years. So, given the times, you would think that the public would just take it in stride, right? What's the big deal? It's just another gangland killing. So what made this one different? Well, for one, there was a different general public mindset than there had been in the past. We'd gone through World War I in the previous decade, and those images of trench warfare were still pretty clear in the public memory. Also, the public never actually supported bootlegging or the gangsters or their lifestyle anyway. I know Hollywood makes it look like we were all on their side, but we really weren't. Most people were not in favor of bootlegging and gangsters. Most people actually did support prohibition, as I mentioned earlier. It was easy for the public to turn a blind eye to what was going on in places like Chicago and New York, so long as it stayed there. But this one didn't, because Jack McGurn could not have picked a worse time. His timing was absolutely terrible. Come on, St. Valentine's Day. Come on, dude. Now, they may have thought it was funny, but the press, they saw it as a godsend from heaven for them. Remember that these newspaper publishers and reporters, a lot of them would have loved to have been responsible for being the people who took down Al Capone. This was their golden opportunity. And the story of what they immediately dubbed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was plastered all over every newspaper in America. So it didn't stay in Chicago. It made its way out through the entire country. And when people read the story about those 7 men shot in the back, which is something you just don't do in this country, ever, not even today, okay? And 3 of them weren't even gangsters. There was just a sudden public outcry of rage against this. Even President Hoover made a statement denouncing the violence in Chicago. For the first time, people suddenly realized that Al Capone wasn't a Robin Hood, and his gang was not a band of merry men sticking a finger up to the man. These guys were heartless, brutal, cold-blooded murderers who would kill anyone that got in their way, shoot them in the back. It had just simply gone too far. Instead of cementing his power in Chicago like Capone believed they would, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre actually signaled the beginning of the end of the golden age of the bootleg gangsters. Ultimately, although indirectly, it even brought Al Capone down. And some people believe that it actually helped lead to the repeal of Prohibition itself. Now, interestingly, all four men who actually committed the murder were themselves murdered shortly afterward. Now, the two Italian mafia guys, Scalise and Anselmi, they were actually killed by Al Capone himself. He discovered they were plotting to assassinate him and take the gang over. So he lured them to what they believed was a banquet, recognizing and honoring them for their service. And instead, he beat them to death with a baseball bat. One of the two men dressed like cops was killed robbing a jewelry store. And the last one was found floating face down in a river with his hands tied behind his back. Go figure. In 1931, Alphonse Capone was sent to prison for income tax evasion. And the South Side gang was quietly taken over by the local mafia. Now, George Moran did not flee Chicago like the Roger Corman version indicates. He actually stayed in Chicago for a couple of years, and he actually remained in charge of the North Side gang, although it just never got back any of the power or influence that it had once had. It was pretty much broken. But Moran even entertained thoughts of relocating to Los Angeles after Prohibition was repealed and setting up an operation there, an even bigger gang than he had in Chicago. Now, he did eventually leave Chicago, but he never made it to Los Angeles. For some reason, he quit the rackets and he took up larceny for a living. Now, he was caught repeatedly and spent the next 20 years or so, in and out of prison. And he was finally sentenced to 11 years in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. But just shortly into that sentence, he died of lung cancer, completely penniless. The one-time second most powerful man in Chicago was buried in a prison yard in Kansas with not a penny in his pocket. Now, during Capone's stay in prison, McGurn was ousted from the gang by the mafia. Now, unemployed, he decided to take up golf, which apparently he was quite good at. Remember, he had really good hand-eye coordination, so he was a really good golfer when he wasn't drunk, which wasn't very often. In fact, one of his favorite golfing partners was a young actor and singer named Bing Crosby. You might have heard of him. In 1936, McGurn was killed himself in a bowling alley. Now, some people think that it was a contract hit put out on him by Frank Nitti, who had taken over control of the gang for the mafia, because McGurn was a really heavy drinker and he loved bragging about his exploits, and the mafia was concerned that he might kind of spill the beans on some things that had gone on in the past. Other people think, though, that it was a revenge shooting by the Goosenberg's little-known third brother, James Goosenberg, who was also in the North Side gang, but wasn't at the garage that day. Whoever it was left a little calling card with him. It went like this: "You've lost your job, your jewels and cars and handsome houses, but things could still be worse, you know. At least you haven't lost your trousers." Well, I'll reserve comment on the poetry. Alphonse Capone was released from prison in 1939 and returned to Miami, and his gangland leading days were over. He lived quietly in his house down in Florida for the rest of his life. But he had managed to put away a little bit of money, about $1.5 billion by today's standards, so he did okay for himself. He died in 1947 of complications from syphilis, which he had contracted years earlier from a prostitute. Now, Moran, interestingly, he died in 1956, so he actually outlived Capone by 9 years. Now, the North Side Gang continued after Moran left, but in name only. It really wasn't a gang anymore. Over the next 20, 30 years, the Mafia just quietly stepped in and absorbed them all. Any gangsters who didn't play ball just simply disappeared quietly, or were just quietly found dead. Now, today, Chicago is by no means a clean town. But it's nothing like it was in the 1920s. There's still illegal activities going on. It's still the Windy City, and Chicagoans still love politics so much, even the dead there get up and vote. But the Chicago typewriter has gone silent. The roaring days are over. With the repeal of Prohibition, the Great Depression, and then World War II, people had a lot more to think about than 7 men being killed in a garage in Chicago. And the event was more or less just forgotten about. I mean, it's interesting because everybody knows about the St. Valentine's Day massacre, but if you pick people out on the street and ask them for any details, they probably couldn't give you any. They probably couldn't even tell you how many men were killed or where they were even killed. It was just, I don't know, somewhere, Chicago or New York, I think, is probably what the answer you get. Detroit, and some might say. So, is there a moral to this story? Well, none that I can think of, except today is Valentine's Day. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.